The blood on Violet Vaughn's hands had long since dried by the time she realized Mrs. Henderson wasn't going to offer her even a cup of water for the 16-hour labor she had just guided through to a successful birth. It was July 1882 in Riverton, Wyoming, and the summer heat made the small cabin feel like an oven, but Violet simply collected her medical bag, nodded at the exhausted mother cradling her newborn son, and stepped out into the dusty street without a word of complaint. She had learned 3 years ago when she first arrived in this rough mining town that gratitude was a luxury most folks couldn't afford, or perhaps wouldn't spare for a woman who did the work that everyone needed, but nobody wanted to acknowledge. Violet was 24 years old, though the responsibility she carried made her seem older in the eyes and younger in the spirit. Her dark auburn hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, and her green eyes held a determination that had gotten her through medical training in Chicago before circumstances brought her west. She was the only trained midwife within 50 miles of Riverton, and she had brought nearly 70 babies into the world since settling here. The thanks she received were scarce, the payments even scarcer, and the respect almost non-existent. Women called for her in their most desperate hours, then looked away when they passed her on the street, as if acknowledging her presence would remind them of their own vulnerability. She walked down the main street toward her small house at the edge of town, her boots kicking up dust with each tired step. The saloon was already loud despite the early hour, and she could hear the sound of hammers from the new church being built on the hill. Riverton was growing, filling with prospectors hoping to strike it rich in the surrounding mountains, settlers looking for land, and opportunists of every variety. It was a hard town in a hard territory, and Violet had learned to match its toughness with her own quiet resilience. She had just reached her front porch when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Violet turned to see a young boy on a horse that was too big for him, his face flushed with panic. "Miss Vaughn! Miss Vaughn!" He pulled the horse to a stop so abruptly that the animal reared slightly. "You have to come quick. There's a woman up in the mountains having a baby and something is wrong. My pa says she is in bad shape." Violet felt the exhaustion in her bones but pushed it aside. "Where in the mountains?" "Up at the old trapping cabin near Eagle Ridge. It is about 2 hours' ride. My pa works with her husband sometimes, and he sent me to fetch you. Please, Miss Vaughn, they say she might die." Violet looked at the boy's desperate face and then at her own front door, behind which waited a bed she had not slept in for nearly 2 days. She looked back at the boy. "Give me 5 minutes to get my horse and supplies." She moved quickly, repacking her medical bag with fresh supplies, changing into riding clothes and saddling her mare. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency even as her mind calculated the risks. Eagle Ridge was remote, the terrain was difficult, and going up into the mountains this late in the day meant she would likely have to spend the night. But a woman in trouble was a woman in trouble, and Violet had never turned away from that call, no matter how inconvenient or dangerous. The boy led the way out of town, and they pushed their horses hard up the winding mountain trails. The temperature dropped as they climbed, which was a relief after the valley heat, but Violet noticed the gathering clouds with concern. Summer storms in the mountains could be fierce and unpredictable. They rode in silence except for the sounds of hooves on rock and the heavy breathing of the horses as the trail grew steeper. After nearly 2.5 hours of hard riding, they finally reached a clearing where a rough-hewn cabin stood against the mountainside. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Violet could hear the sound of a woman crying out in pain even before she dismounted. The boy had not exaggerated. This was bad. She grabbed her bag and hurried inside, finding a scene of chaos. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, was on a bed in the corner, her face pale and soaked with sweat. Two men stood nearby looking helpless and terrified. One was clearly the husband, a thin man with a prospector's build who was wringing his hands. The other man stood near the fireplace, and Violet's breath caught slightly when she saw him. He was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the small cabin. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, and his beard was full but neatly trimmed. His arms were bare beneath his rolled-up sleeves, showing muscles that spoke of years of hard labor in the mountains. His eyes were a striking blue-gray, and they fixed on Violet with an intensity that made her feel suddenly very aware of herself. He looked to be in his late 20s, and everything about him radiated a kind of raw, masculine power that was both intimidating and strangely reassuring. But there was no time for such thoughts. Violet moved quickly to the woman's side, setting down her bag and beginning her examination. "What is your name?" she asked gently. "Sarah," the woman gasped between contractions. "Sarah Miller, the baby. Something is wrong, I can feel it." Violet worked quickly, her trained hands assessing the situation. What she found made her heart sink. The baby was breech, and from what she could tell, the labor had been going on too long. The woman was exhausted and losing strength. This was exactly the kind of situation that could end in tragedy for both mother and child. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and everyone except you," she pointed at the big man by the fireplace. "Needs to leave this cabin right now." The husband started to protest, but the big man spoke for the first time, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the room. "You heard the lady. Out." There was such authority in his tone that the husband and the boy who had fetched Violet filed out without another word. The big man began efficiently preparing hot water and gathering cloths, moving with a competence that surprised Violet. "What is your name?" she asked as she began the delicate work of trying to turn the baby. "Fletcher Hawthorne," he said, bringing her a basin of hot water. "I live about a mile up the mountain. I was bringing them supplies when her labor started." "Have you helped with births before, Mr. Hawthorne?" "Helped deliver foals and calves," he said. "Figured the same steady hands might be useful here." Violet almost smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "Stay close then. I might need those steady hands." For the next hour, Violet worked with every skill she possessed, trying to turn the baby into the correct position. Sarah screamed and cried, and Violet spoke to her in a steady, calm voice, encouraging her, guiding her, refusing to let fear take over. Fletcher Hawthorne stood ready, following Violet's instructions without question, his large hands surprisingly gentle when he helped hold Sarah still or brought Violet the tools she needed. Finally, blessedly, Violet felt the baby shift into position. "Now, Sarah, now you need to push." "Can you do that for me?" Sarah was crying, exhausted beyond measure, but she nodded and gathered what strength remained. Violet guided her through it, and Fletcher stood by like a mountain himself, his presence somehow making the small cabin feel safer, more secure. When the baby finally emerged, it was not breathing. Violet's heart clenched, but she moved with practiced speed, clearing the tiny airways, rubbing the small chest. The seconds stretched like hours. Fletcher watched, his face tense, and Sarah sobbed, too weak to even ask what was happening. Then, the most beautiful sound in the world, a small, indignant cry. The baby began to wail, and Violet nearly collapsed with relief. She cleaned and wrapped the infant, a healthy baby girl despite the difficult birth, and placed her in Sarah's arms. "You have a daughter," Violet said softly, and Sarah began to cry in earnest now, but with joy and relief. Violet tended to Sarah, making sure there was no excessive bleeding, that the afterbirth came properly, that mother and baby were both stable. Only when she was certain everything was as it should be did she finally allow herself to step outside the cabin for some air. Her hands were shaking now that the crisis had passed, and she leaned against the rough log wall, taking deep breaths of the cool mountain air. Fletcher came out a moment later, closing the door quietly behind him. He looked at her with those intense blue-gray eyes. "That was the most incredible thing I have ever seen," he said simply. Violet laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to it. "That was too close. If I had arrived even an hour later." "But you did not," he said firmly. "You saved both of them." She looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time since the crisis had ended. In the fading light of evening, he was even more imposing than she had first thought. His face was rugged and weathered by mountain life, with strong features that looked like they had been carved from the same rock as the peaks around them. But his eyes were kind, and the way he had helped during the birth showed a gentle side that contrasted beautifully with his powerful exterior. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "You were very capable." "Fletcher," he corrected. "And it was you who did the real work. I just followed orders." The husband, whose name turned out to be Thomas Miller, came back inside hesitantly. When he saw his wife and daughter both alive and well, he broke down crying. But he did not thank Violet. He went to his wife, and Violet gathered her things quietly, preparing to make the long ride back to Riverton in the dark. Fletcher watched her. "You cannot ride down the mountain tonight," he said. "It is too dangerous, and there is a storm coming. You can see it in how the wind has shifted." Violet looked at the darkening sky and knew he was right. "I will sleep in the barn or somewhere out of the way." "You will do no such thing," Fletcher said. "My cabin is just up the trail. You will have a proper bed and a hot meal. I insist." Something in the way he said it, with such certainty and such genuine concern, made Violet nod. She was too tired to argue anyway, and the thought of a real meal and a bed was almost overwhelming in its appeal. They rode up the mountain trail in the gathering darkness, and Violet followed Fletcher's broad back, trusting him to know the way. The storm he had predicted began as light rain, making the trail slick. When they finally reached his cabin, Violet was soaked through and shivering despite the summer season. Fletcher's cabin was larger than the miller's place, built with obvious skill and care. Inside it was warm and surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's dwelling. There were furs on the floor, a large stone fireplace, and sturdy furniture that looked handmade. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone but lived well, who took pride in his space. "There is a room in the back you can use," Fletcher said, building up the fire. "It is not much, but the bed is clean. I will heat water so you can wash up, and I will make us something to eat." Violet was too grateful to protest. She changed out of her wet clothes into a dry shirt Fletcher provided, which hung on her like a dress, and washed the blood and grime from her hands and face. When she came back out to the main room, Fletcher had prepared a simple but hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread. The smell alone nearly made her weep. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the exhaustion of the day catching up with both of them. Finally, Fletcher spoke. "How long have you been doing this work?" "I trained for 3 years in Chicago," Violet said, "and I have been in Riverton for 3 years now. So 6 years total, I suppose. And how many times have people thanked you properly for saving their lives and the lives of their children?" The question was so direct and so perceptive that Violet looked up in surprise. Fletcher was watching her with those intense eyes, and she saw genuine curiosity there, not judgment. "Not often," she admitted. "People do not like to be reminded of their vulnerability." And some folks think that women's work, birth work, is not really worth much, even though it is literally the most important work there is. Fletcher shook his head slowly. That is shameful. What you did today, turning that baby, keeping that woman calm, knowing exactly what to do, that took skill and courage and compassion. Any man would be honored to have such abilities. Violet felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words. It was not just the praise, though that was rare enough. It was the way he said it, with such conviction, as if the value of her work was simply an obvious fact that everyone should recognize. "Thank you, Fletcher," she said softly. "That means more than you might know." They talked long into the night, and Violet found herself sharing things she had not spoken about in years. She told him about growing up in Chicago, the daughter of a doctor who had encouraged her education. She told him about her father's death when she was 20, and how the man he had been in business with had cheated her out of her inheritance. She told him about coming west to start over, choosing Riverton because it was far enough away that no one would know her story, and isolated enough that they needed a midwife desperately enough to overlook the fact that she was a woman practicing medicine. Fletcher listened to it all with focused attention, and then he shared his own story. He had come to Wyoming from Montana 5 years ago, after his family died in a harsh winter that took many lives. He had been a trapper and a guide, a man who knew the mountains better than he knew civilization. He lived alone by choice, finding peace in the wilderness that he could not find among people. But there was a loneliness in him too. Violet could sense it, a yearning for connection that he had not found. When Violet finally went to bed in the small back room, she fell asleep almost instantly, but her last thoughts were of Fletcher's kind eyes and strong hands, and the way he had looked at her like she was someone truly worth seeing. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and morning light streaming through the window. Her body ached from the exertion of the previous day, but she felt more rested than she had in weeks. When she came out to the main room, Fletcher was cooking breakfast with the same quiet competence he had shown during the birth. "Good morning," he said, and his smile was warm and genuine. "I thought you might want a good meal before the ride back to town." They ate together, and Violet found herself reluctant to leave. There was something about Fletcher's presence that felt safe and comfortable in a way she had not experienced since her father died. He was strong and capable, yes, but also thoughtful and kind. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and treated her opinions and experiences with respect. When it was finally time to go, Fletcher saddled both their horses. "I will ride with you back to Riverton," he said. "The trails can be tricky after rain." Violet started to protest that she could manage, but the truth was she wanted his company, so she simply nodded and mounted her horse. They rode down the mountain together, talking and laughing, and Violet learned more about Fletcher's life. He told her about tracking mountain lions, about harsh winters spent snowed in for months, about the beauty of the high peaks in autumn. He asked her about the babies she had delivered, the families she had helped, the medical knowledge she had acquired. He asked questions that showed he genuinely cared about the answers. When they reached the outskirts of Riverton, Fletcher hesitated. "Would you allow me to call on you sometime?" he asked, and despite his size and strength, there was a vulnerability in the question that touched Violet's heart. "I would like that very much," she said, and meant it completely. Fletcher smiled, a transformation that lit up his rugged face. "Then I will be in town in a few days. May I take you to dinner?" "Yes," Violet said simply. He tipped his hat to her and turned his horse back toward the mountains, but not before giving her one last look that made her heart skip. Violet rode to her small house, feeling lighter than she had in years. She tended to her horse, unpacked her medical bag, and was just settling in when there was a knock at her door. It was Mrs. Henderson, the woman whose baby she had delivered just 2 days before. "Miss Vaughn," the woman said, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to. I should have. You helped us, and I did not even thank you properly or offer you refreshment. That was wrong of me." Violet was surprised. In 3 years this had never happened. "It is quite all right, Mrs. Henderson." "No, it is not," the woman said firmly. "You do good work, important work, and we have all been treating you poorly. Some of us women were talking and we agreed it needs to change. So thank you for everything you do." After Mrs. Henderson left, Violet sat down in her rocking chair, feeling tears prick at her eyes. Maybe things were changing. Maybe she was finally finding her place here. Over the next few days, more women came by to visit, to thank her, to bring small gifts of food or handmade items. Word had spread somehow about what happened up at the mountain cabin, about how Violet had saved both Sarah Miller and her baby when others would have given up. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the heart of it remained true. Violet was skilled, dedicated, and deserving of respect. When Fletcher came to town 3 days later, riding down the main street on his large horse, looking like some kind of mythic figure from an old tale with his long hair and powerful build, Violet was ready. She wore her best dress, a deep green that matched her eyes, and she had let her hair down from its usual severe bun. Fletcher's eyes widened when he saw her, and he dismounted quickly. "Violet," he said, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like poetry. "You look beautiful." They went to the hotel restaurant, the nicest establishment Riverton had to offer, and Fletcher held the door for her, pulled out her chair, treated her with a courtesy and respect that made her feel cherished. Over dinner, they continued the easy conversation they had started in his cabin, and Violet found herself laughing more than she had in years. Fletcher told her about his plans to expand his trapping operation, about maybe starting to breed horses as well. Violet told him about her hopes to maybe train other women in midwifery, to create a network of skilled birth attendants throughout Wyoming. They talked about books they had read, places they had been, dreams they harbored. When Fletcher walked her home after dinner, the summer night was warm and full of stars. At her door, he took her hand gently in his much larger one. "I would very much like to see you again," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," Violet said, and then, feeling bold, added, "I would like to see you very much as well." Fletcher's smile was bright enough to rival the stars. "Then I will come to town again soon." "And Violet, what you said about training other women, about spreading your knowledge, that is a fine dream. You should pursue it." Over the following weeks, Fletcher became a regular presence in Riverton. He would ride down from his mountain cabin every few days, always with some excuse, bringing Violet supplies she might need, or fresh meat for her table, or simply his company. They would walk together through town, or sit on her porch and talk for hours, and Violet felt herself falling for this gentle giant of a man more deeply with each passing day. The townspeople noticed, of course. Some of the women thought it was romantic, this mountain man courting their midwife. Some of the men grumbled that Fletcher could do better, but those comments stopped abruptly after Fletcher had a quiet word with a few of the more vocal critics. Violet never learned exactly what he said, but the respect people showed her increased noticeably afterward. One evening in late August, Fletcher took Violet on a picnic up into the foothills. He had packed a basket with food, and they rode out to a meadow filled with wildflowers, with a view of the valley below that took Violet's breath away. They spread a blanket and ate and talked as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. "Violet," Fletcher said, taking her hand, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him, seeing the intensity in his blue-gray eyes, the seriousness in his expression. "When I met you that day at the Miller cabin, when I watched you work with such skill and compassion, saving that woman and her baby, something inside me woke up. I have been alone for a long time by choice. I thought I preferred it that way. But you, Violet Vaughn, you have shown me what I was missing. You are brilliant and strong and kind, and you deserve to be cherished and supported in your work. I am falling in love with you, and I needed you to know that." Violet felt tears well up in her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Oh, Fletcher, I am falling in love with you too. You make me feel seen and valued in a way I never have before. You are strong and gentle and good, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it now." Fletcher reached out and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand, his touch infinitely gentle. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," she whispered. When his lips met hers, it was like coming home. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but then it deepened into something that spoke of passion and promise and a future together. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Violet," he said, and it was not quite a question, more like a plea. "Be my wife. Let me support your work and build a life with you. I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Violet laughed through her tears. "Yes, Fletcher Hawthorne. Yes, I will marry you." They married 3 weeks later in the new church on the hill, with half of Riverton in attendance. Violet wore a simple white dress that Fletcher had commissioned from the best seamstress in town, and Fletcher wore a new suit that made him look even more imposing than usual, though his long hair and full beard marked him as the mountain man he was. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Fletcher kissed Violet with a tenderness that made many of the women in attendance sigh. After the wedding, there was a celebration in the town square with food and music and dancing. Fletcher danced with his new wife, and despite his size, he was surprisingly graceful. Violet felt like she was floating, held securely in his strong arms, surrounded by people who were finally, genuinely happy for her. Sarah Miller was there with her baby daughter, who was thriving now, healthy and growing strong. Sarah came up to Violet during a break in the dancing. "Miss Vaughn, Mrs. Hawthorne," Sarah said shyly. "I never properly thanked you for what you did. You saved my life and my daughter's life." "I will never forget that." Violet hugged her impulsively. "You and your daughter are doing well. That is all the thanks I need." But then Thomas Miller, Sarah's husband, stepped forward. "That is not all the thanks you deserve, though," he said. "We know we did not treat you right that day. You rode all that way, worked for hours, saved them both, and we did not even offer you water or thanks. That was shameful. So I want to thank you now properly in front of everyone. Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne. You are a true healer, and this town is blessed to have you." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd, and then one by one, people came forward. Women whose babies Violet had delivered, families she had helped in moments of crisis. They thanked her, each one, and Violet was overwhelmed by the outpouring of gratitude and respect. Fletcher stood beside her through it all, his hand on the small of her back, his presence a constant support. When the last person had spoken, he leaned down and whispered in her ear, "You see, they know your worth. Finally, they are brave enough to acknowledge it." That night, Fletcher carried Violet across the threshold of his mountain cabin, which was now their home. He had spent the past weeks making improvements, adding on a room that could serve as Violet's medical office, building shelves for her books and supplies, making the space truly theirs. He set her down gently once they were inside, and in the firelight he looked at her with such love and desire that Violet felt breathless. "I love you, Violet Hawthorne," he said, and her new name on his lips sounded perfect. "I love you too, Fletcher," she replied. Their wedding night was everything Violet had hoped for and more. Fletcher was passionate but gentle, powerful but tender, always attentive to her needs and responses. He explored her body with reverence, as if she were something precious and sacred, and Violet gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. When they finally came together, it was a joining of not just bodies but souls, a completion that left them both shaken and awed. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Fletcher's large bed, Violet's head on his broad chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, and she felt safer and more content than she ever had in her life. "What are you thinking?" Fletcher asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I am thinking about how my life has changed," Violet said. "A few months ago I was alone, unappreciated, wondering if I had made a mistake coming to Riverton. And now I am here with you, married to the most wonderful man I have ever known, finally receiving recognition for my work. It feels like a dream." Fletcher tightened his arms around her. "It is not a dream. This is real, and it is just the beginning. We are going to build a beautiful life together, Violet. I promise you that." And Fletcher kept that promise. Over the months and years that followed, their life together was full of love and purpose. Violet continued her work as a midwife, but now with Fletcher's full support. He built her a small clinic attached to their cabin where women could come for care, and he helped her establish a training program for other women who wanted to learn midwifery. He would often ride into town with her when she had calls, waiting patiently while she worked, always ready to help if needed. Fletcher's presence seemed to give Violet even more authority and respect. People saw how this strong, capable mountain man valued his wife's work and skills, and it forced them to reconsider their own attitudes. The training program grew, and within 2 years, Violet had taught 5 other women the basics of midwifery, creating a network of skilled attendants throughout the region. Their first year of marriage was blissful, full of discovery and deepening love. Fletcher taught Violet about mountain life, how to track animals, how to read the weather, how to survive in the wilderness. Violet taught Fletcher about medicine and healing, about the miracle of birth, about the strength of women. They learned each other's bodies and hearts, finding joy in both passion and tenderness. In the spring of 1884, Violet discovered she was pregnant with their first child. When she told Fletcher, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, before carefully setting her down and asking anxiously if he had hurt her or the baby. "We are fine," Violet said, laughing at his sudden concern. "I am not fragile, Fletcher." "I know," he said, placing his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "But you are carrying our child, and that makes you both infinitely precious to me." Fletcher was attentive and protective during Violet's pregnancy, sometimes overly so, but Violet found his concern endearing rather than stifling. He built a beautiful cradle from mountain pine, carved with intricate designs of flowers and animals. He made sure Violet did not overwork herself, often taking over her household chores despite her protests. When Violet went into labor in December of 1884, it was with the confidence of someone who had guided countless other women through the process. She had arranged for one of her trained midwives, a capable woman named Margaret, to attend her, and she had Fletcher by her side. The labor was long but not complicated, and Violet was able to maintain her composure through most of it, coaching Margaret through the process even as she experienced it herself. But there were moments of intensity when she gripped Fletcher's hand so hard she was afraid she might break it, and he simply held firm, whispering encouragement and love. When their son finally emerged, screaming lustily and perfectly healthy, Fletcher wept openly. He cut the cord with shaking hands, and when Margaret placed the cleaned and wrapped baby in his arms, he looked down at the tiny face with an expression of such wonder and love that Violet fell in love with him all over again. "We have a son," Fletcher said, his voice thick with emotion. "Violet, we have a son." They named him Thomas Fletcher Hawthorne, honoring both Fletcher's name and Violet's father, who had been named Thomas. Little Tommy, as they called him, was a healthy, robust baby who had his father's blue-gray eyes and his mother's determined spirit. Fletcher was a devoted father from the very first moment. He would wake in the night to bring Tommy to Violet for feeding, change diapers without complaint, and could often be found simply sitting and holding his son, staring at him in amazement. Violet would watch them together, this huge mountain man cradling a tiny infant with such tenderness, and feel her heart overflow with love. Life settled into a new rhythm. Violet continued her midwifery work, but scaled back slightly to care for Tommy. Fletcher adjusted his trapping and guiding work to be closer to home more often. They were building the life they had dreamed of, full of purpose and love and family. When Tommy was 18 months old, Violet became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do, and in the fall of 1886, they welcomed a daughter into the world. They named her Elena Rose Hawthorne, and she was a beautiful baby with auburn hair like her mother's and a sweet, calm temperament. Fletcher was just as devoted to Elena as he was to Tommy, proving himself equally capable of handling both a rambunctious toddler and a newborn. Violet would often find him in the evenings with Tommy on one knee and Elena cradled in his other arm, telling them stories about the mountains and the animals that lived there. The cabin that had once been Fletcher's solitary retreat was now filled with the sounds of family. Children's laughter, Violet singing as she worked, Fletcher's deep voice reading stories or telling tales. They added on to the structure twice more, creating more bedrooms and a larger common area, building a home that could hold their growing family and the life they were creating. Violet's midwifery practice continued to thrive. She had trained nearly a dozen women by the time Elena was born, and her reputation had spread far beyond Riverton. Women would travel from surrounding towns specifically to seek her care or her training. The network of midwives she had created was saving lives throughout Wyoming, and Violet felt a deep sense of pride and accomplishment in that work. Fletcher supported every aspect of her career, never once suggesting she should give it up to focus solely on motherhood. Instead, he made it possible for her to do both, taking over childcare when she had to attend births, helping her with her training programs, even learning enough himself that he could assist in emergencies. The respect Violet had earned in Riverton only grew over the years. She was no longer the midwife nobody thanked. She was Mrs. Hawthorne, the healer, the teacher, the woman who had saved countless lives. People sought her advice on medical matters beyond just childbirth, and she found herself becoming a kind of general practitioner for the community, treating injuries and illnesses with the same skill and compassion she brought to her midwifery work. But it was Fletcher's constant, unwavering support and love that meant the most to her. He had given her not just his name but his respect, his partnership, his complete faith in her abilities. He had stood beside her as she built her career and her reputation, and he had given her the family she had always wanted. One evening in the summer of 1888, when Tommy was 3 and Elena was nearly 2, the family sat together on the porch of their mountain home, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and pink. Tommy was chattering about a butterfly he had seen, and Elena was contentedly playing with a wooden horse Fletcher had carved for her. Violet leaned against her husband's solid shoulder, feeling his arm come around her naturally, holding her close. "Are you happy?" Fletcher asked softly, a question he still asked her sometimes, as if needing reassurance that he had given her the life she deserved. Violet looked at her children, healthy and loved. She thought about her work, meaningful and respected. She felt the strength of her husband's embrace, the security of his love. She thought about how far she had come from that exhausted, unappreciated woman walking alone through Riverton's dusty streets. "I am happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said truthfully. "You gave me everything, Fletcher. Your love, your support, your name, your respect. You saw my worth when others could not or would not. You made me believe in myself again." Fletcher pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You always had worth, Violet. I just had the good sense to recognize it and the blessing of being allowed to share your life. You have given me just as much. You gave me a family, a purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to come down from the mountain and rejoin the world. You saved me just as surely as you saved Sarah Miller and her baby that day." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children play, watching the light fade into evening. Violet thought about that day, the day everything changed, when a panicked boy rode into town looking for the midwife nobody thanked, and she rode up into the mountains and found the man who would change her life forever. In the months that followed, life continued its beautiful rhythm. Violet delivered more babies, taught more students, built her legacy. Fletcher expanded his horse breeding operation, which was becoming quite successful, and proved himself an excellent businessman as well as a skilled outdoorsman. Tommy started helping his father with the horses, showing an early aptitude for working with animals. Eleanor followed her mother around, watching everything with wide, curious eyes. In the winter of 1888, a harsh snowstorm trapped the family in their cabin for nearly 2 weeks. It could have been a difficult time, isolated and confined, but instead it became one of Violet's favorite memories. They played games, told stories, and Fletcher taught the children songs he had learned as a boy. Violet worked on her medical journals, documenting techniques and treatments for future midwives. They made love quietly in the deep of night while the children slept, cherishing the intimacy and connection that had only grown stronger over the years. When spring came in 1889, bringing the thaw and the return of color to the mountains, Violet discovered she was pregnant once more. She was 31 now, and this would be their third child. Fletcher was overjoyed, and Tommy and Eleanor were excited about becoming older siblings. This pregnancy was different from the first two. Violet felt more tired, and there were complications she had not experienced before. Fletcher worried constantly, and Violet had to reassure him daily that she was being careful, that she was monitoring herself closely with all her medical knowledge. When she went into labor in October of 1889, it was faster and more intense than her previous births. Fletcher sent for Margaret immediately, but the baby was coming quickly. In the end, it was Fletcher who caught his second son as he entered the world, his hands steady despite his fear, his voice calm as he talked Violet through the final pushes. When Margaret arrived 15 minutes later, she found mother and baby both doing well, and Fletcher sitting on the bed beside Violet, holding their new son with tears streaming down his face. They named him James Robert Hawthorne, and he was a large, healthy baby who seemed determined to make his presence known from the very beginning with his loud cries and vigorous appetite. With 3 children now, the cabin was full of energy and noise and life. Violet had to further reduce her midwifery work, but she did not mind. She had trained enough other women that the region was well covered, and her children were only young once. Fletcher took on more of the business operations, hiring help with the horses so he could be home more often. Tommy at 4 was already showing signs of his father's size and strength, a sturdy boy who loved the outdoors and animals. Alina at 3 was sweet and gentle, with a natural empathy that reminded Violet of herself. And baby James was strong-willed and determined, keeping everyone on their toes. Fletcher proved himself capable of handling all 3 children at once, often taking them on adventures into the nearby woods while Violet had time to work on her medical writings or simply rest. She would watch him leave with Tommy and Alina, walking beside him and James strapped to his chest in a carrier he had fashioned, and marvel at how this solitary mountain man had become such a devoted family man. The years passed in a blur of birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, children's milestones, and quiet moments of connection between Violet and Fletcher. They had built a life that was full and meaningful, grounded in mutual respect and deep love. In 1892, when Tommy was 7, Alina was 5, and James was 2, Violet was approached by a publisher from Denver who had heard about her work. He wanted to publish a comprehensive manual on midwifery based on her techniques and training methods. Violet was hesitant at first, doubting that anyone would be interested in a book written by a woman about women's medicine, but Fletcher encouraged her strongly. "The world needs this knowledge, Violet. How many women could be saved if midwives everywhere had access to your expertise? You have to do this." So Violet wrote the book, working on it in the evenings after the children were asleep, documenting everything she had learned over more than a decade of practice. Fletcher read each chapter as she completed it, offering suggestions and encouragement, helping her refine her explanations for a general audience. The book was published in the spring of 1893, and to Violet's surprise, it was a success. Midwives and doctors across the country ordered copies, and Violet began receiving letters from women thanking her for sharing her knowledge, telling her how the book had helped them save lives. She had gone from being the midwife nobody thanked to being thanked by women she would never meet, women whose lives she touched through her written words. It was a profound and humbling experience. Fletcher was immensely proud of her, showing the book to everyone who visited and talking about his wife's accomplishments with obvious admiration. The children were too young to fully understand, but they knew their mother had done something important, and they beamed with reflected pride. That summer, the family took a trip to Denver so Violet could meet with her publisher and give a lecture at a medical college. It was Tommy and Alina's first time seeing a real city, and James was endlessly fascinated by the trains and crowds. Fletcher handled the unfamiliar urban environment with his usual calm competence, keeping the children safe and entertained while Violet attended to her professional obligations. At the medical college, Violet spoke to a room full of doctors and medical students about her midwifery techniques and the importance of properly trained birth attendants. There were only a handful of women in the audience, and Violet could see the skepticism on many of the men's faces. But she spoke with confidence and authority, backed by years of successful practice and hundreds of healthy births. Fletcher sat in the front row with all 3 children, and whenever Violet felt her confidence waver, she would look at him, at his steady, supportive gaze, and find her strength renewed. When she finished her lecture, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic, and several doctors came up afterward to discuss her methods in greater detail. On the train ride home to Wyoming, as the children slept in their compartment and the landscape rolled by outside the window, Fletcher took Violet's hand. "You were magnificent," he said. "Watching you up there, speaking with such knowledge and authority, I was so proud I thought my heart would burst." Violet smiled and squeezed his hand. "I could not have done any of it without you, Fletcher. Your support, Your belief in me, it has made everything possible." "We make a good team," Fletcher said, pulling her close. "Always have, from that very first day." When they returned to Riverton, they found the town had grown considerably in their absence. More families were settling in the area, and there was talk of Wyoming soon becoming a state. The church on the hill had been expanded, a proper school had been built, and there were plans for a hospital. Violet was approached about being involved in the hospital planning, and she threw herself into the project with enthusiasm. She worked with the town council to ensure that the hospital would have a proper maternity ward, and that trained midwives would be valued as part of the medical staff. Fletcher supported her involvement, taking on even more of the childcare and household management so she could focus on this important work. The hospital opened in the fall of 1894, a modest but well-equipped facility that served the growing population of Riverton and the surrounding areas. Violet was named the head of the maternity ward, a position that came with both responsibility and respect. She continued to attend home births for women who preferred them, but now she also had a clean, safe facility where complicated cases could be handled. Life was full and busy, but good. Tommy was growing into a thoughtful, capable boy who loved working with his father and the horses. Eleanor was sweet and studious, already reading beyond her years and showing an interest in her mother's medical work. James was energetic and adventurous, constantly getting into mischief and keeping everyone entertained. Fletcher and Violet's love for each other only deepened with time. They still stole moments of intimacy when they could, still talked for hours about their dreams and plans, still looked at each other with the same wonder and appreciation they had felt at the beginning. Their physical relationship remained passionate and satisfying, a source of connection and joy that sustained them through the challenges of raising children and building careers. In the winter of 1895, tragedy struck Riverton when a mine collapse trapped several men underground. Violet worked around the clock at the hospital, treating the injured as they were brought out, her medical skills pushed to their limits. Fletcher was part of the rescue effort, using his strength and knowledge of mining techniques to help dig through the rubble. For 3 days, the town held its breath. Violet saved the lives of 4 men who would have died without her quick thinking and skilled treatment. Fletcher helped pull out 6 men who were trapped in a pocket of air, his calm competence under pressure proving invaluable. When it was finally over, when all the survivors had been accounted for and the dead mourned, the town held a memorial service. The preacher spoke about the heroes among them, and he specifically named Violet and Fletcher Hawthorne, talking about how they had each used their unique skills to save lives. Afterward, person after person came up to thank them both. Not the grudging, uncomfortable thanks Violet had received in her early years, but genuine, heartfelt gratitude. Fletcher stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, and they accepted the thanks together as partners. That night, after they had checked on their sleeping children and retired to their own room, Fletcher held Violet close. "You remember what you said to me once," he asked, "about how people did not like to acknowledge their vulnerability by thanking you." "I remember," Violet said. "I think they have learned," Fletcher said, "not just to acknowledge it but to appreciate it. You have changed this town, Violet. You have changed how they think about healing, about women's work, about what matters, and you did it through sheer excellence and determination." Violet turned in his arms to face him. "We did it together, Fletcher. Your support gave me the strength and security to keep pushing, to keep fighting for respect and recognition. Your love made me brave." They made love that night with a tenderness born of years of intimacy and trust. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Violet thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that desperate ride up the mountain to save Sarah Miller, to this moment of peace and fulfillment, it had been a remarkable path. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their children growing up. Tommy became a teenager, tall and strong like his father, with a quiet confidence that served him well. Eleanor developed into a bright, compassionate young woman who decided she wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps and become a midwife herself. James was the wild child, always pushing boundaries and testing limits, but with a good heart underneath his mischief. In 1900, Wyoming officially became a state, and Riverton celebrated with a grand festival. Violet and Fletcher attended with their children, now 15, 13, and 10, and marveled at how much the town and territory had changed since they had first met 18 years before. The hospital Violet had helped establish had expanded twice. The network of trained midwives she had created covered the entire state. Her book had gone through 3 editions and was being used in medical schools across the country. She had achieved more than she had ever dreamed possible when she was that tired, unappreciated woman walking through Riverton's dusty streets. And through it all, Fletcher had been beside her. He had aged well, his hair now showing silver at the temples, his face lined by years of mountain weather and laughter. He was still strong and capable, still the most handsome man Violet had ever seen, still her greatest supporter and truest love. When Eleanor was 18, in 1903, she began her formal training in midwifery under her mother's tutelage. Violet had never pushed her daughter toward this path, but Eleanor had chosen it on her own, inspired by her mother's work and passion. Watching her daughter deliver her first baby, seeing Eleanor's skill and compassion, Violet felt a pride so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Fletcher stood beside her during that first birth Eleanor attended, and he took Violet's hand. "She is just like you," he said softly. "Strong and skilled and determined to make a difference." "She is better than me," Violet said. "She has had the support and training from the beginning that I had to fight for. She will do amazing things." Tommy, at 18, had decided to go to university to study veterinary medicine, combining his love of animals with his interest in healing. Fletcher was immensely proud, though he would miss having his sons help with the horses. James, at 13, was still finding his path, but he showed signs of his father's business acumen and his mother's compassion. As their children grew into adults and began their own lives, Violet and Fletcher found themselves with more time for each other again. They would take rides into the mountains, just the two of them, revisiting places that held special memories. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, talking about their children and their dreams and the life they had built together. In 1905, at the age of 47, Violet delivered her last baby as an active midwife. She was training the next generation now, passing on her knowledge and skills, but she was ready to step back from the hands-on work. Her body was showing the wear of years of physical labor, and she wanted to focus more on writing and teaching. Fletcher, at 50, was still active and strong, but he too was beginning to think about slowing down. He had built the horse breeding business into a successful enterprise that could be managed by the men he employed. He wanted to spend more time with Violet, to travel a bit, to enjoy the fruits of their years of hard work. That summer, they took a trip to San Francisco, something they had talked about for years. They left the children, now all capable adults, to manage things at home, and they set off on an adventure together. They stayed in nice hotels, ate in fancy restaurants, walked along the beach holding hands like newlyweds. It was a second honeymoon of sorts, a celebration of their love and their life together. One evening, as they watched the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, Fletcher turned to Violet. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked. "About the life we have lived, the choices we made?" Violet thought about it seriously before answering. "No," she said finally. "Not one. Every challenge, every struggle, it all led us here. To this love, this family, this life. How could I regret any of that?" Fletcher smiled and pulled her close. "Good, because I do not either. Marrying you was the best decision I ever made. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Violet Hawthorne." "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me, Fletcher Hawthorne. You saw me when others would not. You valued me when others did not. You loved me completely and gave me the freedom to be everything I was capable of being. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and Violet felt the same thrill, the same joy, the same rightness that she had felt the first time Fletcher had kissed her all those years ago. When they returned to Riverton, they found that Alina had successfully delivered 5 babies in their absence and was ready to take over as the primary midwife for the region. Tommy sent letters from university full of enthusiasm for his studies. James had apparently kept things running smoothly at the ranch, showing a responsibility that surprised and pleased his parents. Violet settled into her role as teacher and mentor with contentment. She worked on a second book, this one about women's health more broadly, and she gave lectures at medical colleges throughout the West. She was in demand as a speaker and consultant, respected and valued in a way that still sometimes surprised her when she thought about those early years of being overlooked and unappreciated. Fletcher managed the ranch with a lighter hand now, trusting his employees and enjoying the work more since it was not his sole focus. He and Violet spent their evenings together, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes in lively conversation, always in love. In 1908, Alina married a young doctor she had met through her work, a man who respected her skills and supported her career much as Fletcher had always supported Violet's. The wedding was held at the church in Riverton, and Violet cried happy tears as she watched her daughter begin her own journey into married life. Tommy graduated from university and returned to Wyoming, setting up a veterinary practice in Riverton that quickly became successful. He brought his skills to both domestic animals and the wildlife of the region, and he made his parents proud with his dedication and expertise. James, at 18, surprised everyone by announcing he wanted to be a teacher. He went off to normal school to get his certification, and Violet and Fletcher marveled at how all 3 of their children had found paths that involved helping others, each in their own unique way. As Violet approached 50, she found herself thinking often about the journey of her life. She had come to Wyoming broken and alone, cheated out of her inheritance, looking for a fresh start. She had worked for years in obscurity, helping people who would not acknowledge her, fighting for respect and recognition in a world that did not value women's work. And then Fletcher had come into her life, this mountain man with strong hands and a gentle heart, and everything had changed. He had not just given her his name, though that had been significant in a time and place where a woman's marital status mattered so much. He had given her his respect, his support, his unwavering belief in her worth and abilities. He had been her partner in the truest sense, sharing not just a home and a bed but a vision for what their life could be. Together, they had built something remarkable, a family full of love and capability. A legacy of healing and teaching that would continue through Alina and the many other midwives Violet had trained. A life full of purpose and meaning and deep, abiding love. One autumn evening in 1910, as they sat on their porch watching the changing leaves on the aspens, their hands intertwined as they had been countless times over the past 28 years. Fletcher spoke. "I have been thinking," he said, "about that day we met. When I was helping the Millers and you came riding up the mountain to save Sarah and her baby. Do you remember?" "Of course I remember," Violet said. "That was the day my whole life changed." "Mine too," Fletcher said. "I watched you work, so skilled and confident and compassionate, and something just clicked inside me. I thought, that is the woman I want beside me for the rest of my life, and I have never once wavered from that thought." Violet turned to look at him, this man who had been her rock, her love, her partner through nearly 3 decades of life. His hair was mostly silver now, his face deeply lined, but his blue-gray eyes still held the same intensity, the same love, the same commitment they had always held. "I love you, Fletcher Hawthorne," she said. "I have loved you from almost the beginning, and I will love you until the end. You are the best man I have ever known. And I love you, Violet Hawthorne. You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met, and I am honored to be your husband." They sat together as the sun set, comfortable in the silence of long companionship, secure in the knowledge of their love. Around them, the mountains rose, eternal and unchanging. Inside their home, the evidence of their life together filled every corner, memories and accomplishments, struggles overcome and joys celebrated. The years that followed were peaceful and fulfilling. Violet continued her teaching and writing, becoming an elder stateswoman of midwifery in Wyoming and beyond. Fletcher enjoyed his semi-retirement, working with the horses he loved and spending time with Violet. Their children all succeeded in their chosen fields and began families of their own. In 1912, Violet and Fletcher became grandparents for the first time when Alina gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Violet attended the birth, of course, but as a grandmother rather than as the primary midwife. Watching Alina work with the same skill and compassion Violet had always brought to her practice was one of the proudest moments of her life. Fletcher held his grandson with the same tenderness he had shown their own children, and Violet saw tears in his eyes as he looked down at the tiny face. "We did good, Violet," he said softly. "We built something that lasts." More grandchildren followed over the years. Tommy married and had 3 children. James married a teacher he met at normal school and they had 2 children. Alina had 4 children total. The ranch house that had once held just Fletcher in solitary isolation now rang with the laughter of multiple generations during family gatherings. Violet retired fully from active practice when she was 55, handing over all her responsibilities to Alina and the other midwives she had trained. She focused on her writing and on her grandchildren, finding joy in this new phase of life. Fletcher scaled back his work even further, and they spent long, lazy days together, taking walks, reading, talking, simply being together. One night, when they were both in their 60s, lying in bed after making love with the slower, sweeter passion of long partnership, Violet asked Fletcher a question that had been on her mind. "You ever miss it? The solitary life you had before me, the freedom of being alone in the mountains?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he pulled her closer, tucking her head under his chin. "Not even for a second," he said firmly. "That was not living, Violet. That was just existing. You taught me the difference. You, our children, our grandchildren, the life we built together. That is living. That is what makes it all worthwhile. I would not trade a single moment of our life together for all the solitary freedom in the world." Violet felt tears prick her eyes. Even after all these years, Fletcher could still move her to tears with his words, his love, his complete commitment to their partnership. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "You saved me, Fletcher, not just from loneliness but from a life half-lived. You made me believe I deserved to be valued and loved. You gave me everything." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, and it was a pattern that would continue for years to come. As they moved into their 70s, their pace slowed even more, but their love never diminished. They watched their grandchildren grow, attended weddings and baptisms and graduations. They saw Riverton transform from a rough mining town into a thriving city. They witnessed the world change around them, but their commitment to each other remained constant. Violet published her final book when she was 72, a memoir of her years as a midwife that became something of a bestseller. In it, she wrote honestly about the struggles she had faced, the lack of recognition and respect, the loneliness of her early years in Riverton. But she also wrote about the joy of her work, the miracle of each birth, the satisfaction of training the next generation. And she wrote about Fletcher, dedicating an entire chapter to the man who had changed her life. She wrote about how he had seen her worth when others could not, how he had supported her dreams and ambitions, how he had been a true partner in every sense of the word. She wrote about how his love had given her the strength to keep fighting, to keep pushing for recognition, to keep believing in the value of her work. When the book was published, Fletcher read that chapter and wept. "You give me too much credit," he said. "I give you exactly the right amount of credit," Violet corrected. "You were the one who thanked me, Fletcher, when no one else would. You gave me your name, but more importantly, you gave me your respect and your love. That made all the difference." In their late 70s, they slowed down significantly. Fletcher's body, which had been so strong for so many years, began to show the wear of a lifetime of hard work. Violet's hands, which had delivered hundreds of babies and saved countless lives, developed arthritis that made even simple tasks difficult. But they cared for each other with patience and tenderness, helping each other with the tasks that had become challenging, never complaining, always grateful for each day they had together. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1933, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The celebration was held at the ranch, and people came from all over Wyoming to honor the couple who had made such a difference in so many lives. Speech after speech praised Violet's contributions to medicine and midwifery, her training programs, her books, her tireless work on behalf of women and children. But Violet deflected the praise, always bringing it back to the partnership she and Fletcher had formed. "I could not have done any of it without my husband," she said in her own speech. "Fletcher Hawthorne saw my worth when I was just a tired, unappreciated midwife walking through Riverton streets. He thanked me for my work when no one else would. He supported my dreams and ambitions. He made it possible for me to become everything I was capable of becoming. This is his achievement as much as mine." Fletcher stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her in front of everyone, and the crowd cheered. At 77 and 74, respectively, they still showed the love and affection that had characterized their entire marriage. As they moved into their 80s, they knew their time together was growing shorter, but they faced it with the same courage and partnership they had brought to every other challenge in their lives. They talked openly about death, about their wishes, about their gratitude for the life they had shared. "I have no regrets, Violet," Fletcher said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset, a ritual they had maintained for more than 50 years. "I've lived a full, rich life, and it is all because of you." "We have lived a full, rich life together," Violet corrected. "We were a team, Fletcher, the best team I could have ever asked for." Fletcher passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1935 at the age of 82. Violet woke to find him gone, his hand still holding hers, his face peaceful. She sat with him for a long time, crying but also grateful. They had had more than 50 years together, years full of love and purpose and joy. He had never suffered, never lingered in pain. He had simply slipped away, his life complete, his legacy secure. The funeral was one of the largest Riverton had ever seen. People came from all over to pay their respects to the mountain man who had become a pillar of the community, the businessman who had treated everyone fairly, the father and grandfather who had loved his family fiercely, the husband who had stood beside his extraordinary wife for more than half a century. Violet stood at the graveside supported by her children and grandchildren, and she spoke about the man she had loved. "Fletcher Hawthorne was the best man I ever knew," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He was strong and gentle, powerful and kind. He saw the worth in others and helped them see it in themselves. He gave me the greatest gift anyone can give another person. He believed in me completely. He thanked me for my work when no one else would, and that simple act of recognition changed my entire life. I will love him until my dying day, and I will be grateful for every moment we had together." Violet lived for 3 more years after Fletcher's death, years that were harder than any she had faced before. She missed him with an ache that never fully eased, but she took comfort in her children and grandchildren, in the legacy they had built together, in the knowledge that she had been truly, deeply loved. She spent those years organizing their papers, ensuring that Fletcher's contributions to their shared success were properly documented. She made sure everyone knew that while she had been the midwife who saved lives, he had been the man who made it all possible through his unwavering support and love. Violet Hawthorne passed away in her sleep in the spring of 1938, at the age of 80. She was buried beside Fletcher on a hillside overlooking the mountains they had both loved, under a headstone that read, "Violet Vaughn Hawthorne, healer, teacher, mother, wife. She brought life into the world and brought honor to her calling." At her funeral, Alina spoke about her mother's legacy, the hundreds of lives saved, the countless midwives trained, the books written, the respect earned. But she ended with this: "My mother always said that my father's greatest gift to her was his belief in her worth. He thanked her for her work when no one else would. He gave her his name, but more importantly, he gave her his respect, his support, and his love. Together, they built a life of purpose and meaning, and they showed us all what true partnership looks like. We honor both of them today, knowing they are together again, as they were always meant to be." The legacy of Violet and Fletcher Hawthorne lived on through their children and grandchildren, through the midwives Violet had trained, through the lives that had been saved by her skill and knowledge. Their story became part of Riverton's history, a reminder that love and respect and partnership could overcome any obstacle, could build something beautiful and lasting out of even the hardest circumstances. In the mountains above Riverton, in the cabin that Fletcher had built and that Violet had made into a home, their great-grandchildren would sometimes visit, and they would tell the story of the midwife everyone called for but nobody thanked, and the mountain man who thanked her with his name. They would tell it as a love story, which it was, but also as a story about recognition and respect, about the value of women's work, about the power of true partnership. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Wyoming mountains painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, it was as if Violet and Fletcher were there still, sitting on their porch, hands intertwined, watching the beauty of the world they had loved, together for all eternity as they had been in life, partners in everything, bound by a love that death itself could not diminish. Their story was complete, their lives well lived, their love eternal. They had faced every challenge together, celebrated every joy together, built a legacy that would endure for generations. The midwife had found her worth reflected in the eyes of the mountain man who loved her, and together they had created something beautiful, something lasting, something true. It was, in the end, exactly the life they had both dreamed of and worked for, a life of purpose and passion and deep, abiding love. And that, more than any other achievement, more than any recognition or respect, was their greatest legacy. The proof that true love, built on mutual respect and unwavering support, could transform lives and create miracles that echoed through generations.